there exists a story whispered in the darkest corners of gaming history, a tale carved from shadows and dressed in the language of Shakespeare, where memory becomes weapon and truth dissolves like morning mist beneath an unforgiving sun. This is not a story about heroes rising to save kingdoms, nor about chosen ones fulfilling their destined purpose. This is something far more intimate, far more unsettling. This is a story about a man who cannot trust his own mind, hunting another man who may know him better than he knows himself, through streets where the dead refuse to remain silent and the past refuses to stay buried. The world of Ivalice sprawls across ages and continents, a realm where magic once flowed like rivers and civilizations rose to heights that modern kingdoms can barely comprehend. But by the time our story begins, magic has retreated into legend. Monsters have become myths told to frighten children, and humanity has turned its destructive attention inward, engaging in the same political machinations and power struggles that have consumed every civilization since the first person realized that controlling others was easier than understanding them. The world had grown smaller, more mundane, more human in all the worst ways. Valendia stands as one of Ivalice's newer kingdoms, born from civil war and baptized in the blood of those who believed their claim to power exceeded all others. 3 decades prior, noble houses tore the region apart in a conflict that left no family untouched and no institution unchanged. When the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted, a new order emerged, one built on carefully negotiated compromises that satisfied no one completely, but prevented anyone from possessing sufficient power to restart the violence. This delicate balance was maintained through 3 primary institutions, each watching the others with the paranoid vigilance of rivals who remembered too clearly what unchecked ambition had cost them all. Parliament represented the secular authority, the voice of nobility and commerce, the pragmatic force that concerned itself with taxes and territories, and the mundane machinery of governance that kept society functioning. They commanded the Valendia Knights of the Peace, a military force responsible for maintaining order throughout the kingdom, investigating crimes that threatened the realm's stability, and eliminating threats before those threats could metastasize into full-blown crises. Within the VKP existed an elite unit known as the Risk Breakers, operatives who worked alone on missions so sensitive that official acknowledgement of their existence would create diplomatic catastrophes. These were the kingdom's scalpels, precise instruments deployed to cut out cancers before they could spread, answerable only to Parliament's highest echelons and granted immunity from prosecution for whatever methods they deemed necessary to accomplish their objectives. The priesthood of St. Iocus provided spiritual authority, claiming dominion over souls, while Parliament concerned itself with bodies. Centuries earlier, the Iocus clergy had waged brutal campaigns against competing faiths, particularly the Kiltan religion, with its uncomfortable associations with darker magics and forbidden knowledge. Through inquisitions that history remembered with appropriate horror, the Iocus priesthood had established itself as Valendia's sole legitimate spiritual authority, crushing alternatives with the same efficiency that gardeners apply when pulling weeds. The church maintained its own military force, the Order of the Crimson Blades, technically subordinate to Parliament, but in practice operating with considerable autonomy under the direction of Cardinal Batstum. These knights served as both symbol and substance of the church's temporal power, reminding secular authorities that spiritual influence could manifest through very physical means when circumstances demanded. Between these 2 pillars of authority existed tension that occasionally flared into open conflict, each side probing for weaknesses in the other's position. each seeking advantages that could shift the balance of power incrementally in their favor. Parliament resented the Church's influence over public opinion and its ability to mobilize popular sentiment against secular policies. The Church bristled at Parliament's control over taxation and territorial jurisdiction, viewing temporal authority as ultimately subordinate to spiritual truths. They cooperated when necessary, competed when possible, and maintained elaborate networks of spies to ensure that neither side gained surprise advantage over the other. Into this carefully balanced dysfunction came whispers of a third force, something older and more dangerous than either Parliament or Church, something that both institutions had worked for generations to suppress, but had never fully destroyed. The Millenkamp cult took its name from an ancient Kiltian priestess, whose legacy the Iokas clergy had spent centuries attempting to erase from history. Where St. Iokas represented light, order, and hierarchical structure, Millenkamp embodied something else, something that civilization had deemed too dangerous to tolerate. The cult worshipped the dark, not as evil, but as a fundamental force of reality, one that granted power to those who understood its nature and could survive its embrace. The dark offered strength beyond normal human limits, knowledge hidden from conventional understanding, and access to abilities that modern Valendia considered impossible, because acknowledging their existence would require admitting that the universe operated according to rules that contemporary philosophy refused to accept. Officially, Millenkamp barely existed, just scattered remnants of an ancient heresy that posed no real threat to established authority. Unofficially, both Parliament and Church recognized that the cult had grown stronger in recent years, organized under new leadership, attracting followers who felt alienated from both secular and religious institutions. Intelligence reports spoke of a charismatic leader, someone with genuine power, who preached about humanity's lost potential and the coming end of the current order. The name that appeared in these reports, whispered in chambers where secrets were currency, was Sydney Losstarot, a figure who seemed to exist halfway between human and something else, wielding abilities that should not be possible in an age when magic had supposedly retreated from the world. And then there was Lea Monde, the cursed city, the dark jewel around which all these forces would eventually orbit. Founded 2,000 years before by the original priestess Millenkamp herself, Lea Monde had served as the beating heart of Kiltin power, a city where the dark flowed through streets like water, and inhabitants learned to live in harmony with forces that other civilizations feared or rejected. The city thrived for centuries, home to scholars who studied forbidden texts and priests who conducted rituals that would have horrified their Iokas counterparts. Its wine cellars produced vintages that nobles across the continent prized above all others. Its limestone quarries provided building materials that architects considered superior to anything modern industry could produce. Its libraries contained knowledge accumulated over millennia, texts that traced humanity's relationship with the dark back to civilizations whose names had been forgotten before Valendia's founding families ever drew breath. Then, 25 years before our story begins, catastrophe struck. An earthquake of devastating magnitude tore through Lea Monde, killing every man, woman, and child within the city walls. Buildings collapsed, streets cracked open, and the earth itself seemed to reject the settlement that had existed on its surface for 2 millennia. When the shaking stopped and rescue parties finally reached the city, they found only corpses and ruins. No survivors emerged from the rubble. No one had escaped through the wine cellars or the quarry tunnels. 5,000 people died in a single day, and Lea Monde transformed from thriving metropolis into tomb. But the official story, The version that appeared in parliamentary records and church archives concealed more than it revealed. Intelligence suggested the earthquake had not been entirely natural, that powerful forces had deliberately cultivated the catastrophe. Some whispered that Parliament had discovered Lea Monde sat atop a wellspring of the dark, a concentration of that ancient power so intense that properly harnessing it could grant whoever controlled it effective dominion over the entire region, whether through summoning ancient entities or through other terrible methods. The city's destruction had been orchestrated, its people sacrificed, their souls fed to the dark in a ritual of mass murder disguised as natural disaster. The plan had succeeded and failed simultaneously. The city was destroyed and its people killed, their souls consumed by the dark as intended. But the power remained beyond Parliament's grasp, locked away by safeguards they had not anticipated and did not understand. The earthquake had separated Lea Monde from the surrounding landmass, creating an island surrounded by treacherous waters and violent whirlpools. The city became inaccessible, a forbidden zone that few could reach and fewer could leave. Those who entered discovered that death worked differently within Lea Monde's walls. The dark prevented souls from properly dying, trapping them in a state that church scholars called incomplete death. Bodies decayed but spirits persisted, animating corpses, possessing suits of armor, manifesting as phantoms that wandered streets where they had once lived. The city became haunted in the most literal sense, populated by the angry dead who remembered their murder and sought vengeance against forces they could not identify or reach. Into this poisoned well of history and conspiracy, into this nexus of competing ambitions and ancient powers, would step a man whose entire existence was built on foundations of carefully constructed lies. Ashley Riot represented everything a risk-breaker should be: skilled, dedicated, emotionally controlled to the point of appearing mechanical, capable of performing any action his mission required without hesitation or moral complication. He had graduated at the top of his class from the VKP Academy, earning recognition as the most promising agent of his generation. His service record documented over 100 successful operations, missions that others had deemed impossible, but which Ashley had accomplished with an efficiency that inspired equal measures of admiration and unease among his superiors. According to the story Ashley believed about his own life, the story that shaped his identity and motivated his actions, he had once been a husband and father. His wife Tia had been beautiful and kind, the sort of person who saw good in everyone and believed that patience and compassion could solve most problems. Their son Marco had inherited his mother's optimism and his father's determination, a child who asked endless questions and greeted each day with enthusiasm that exhausted his parents even as it delighted them. They had been happy, or at least Ashley remembered being happy, in that uncomplicated way that families are happy when they have not yet learned how fragile such contentment truly is. The family's destruction came suddenly, senselessly, as these things often do. They had gone on a picnic, seeking to enjoy a beautiful day away from the capital's noise and crowds. While Tia and Marco spread their blanket beneath a tree on a hillside where grass grew green and wind whispered through leaves, tragedy found them. Bandits or renegade soldiers or simply evil men. The details varied depending on which version of the memory Ashley accessed attacked the defenseless woman and child. By the time Ashley returned from gathering firewood, it was too late. Tia lay dead, Marco's small body beside hers, blood-staining grass that had moments before seemed too perfect to exist in the real world. The killers were gone, vanished into the countryside, leaving Ashley with nothing but grief and rage and the absolute conviction that he had failed the people who depended on him most. That grief and rage had driven him to transfer from the King's Guard, where he had served as an elite protector of royalty, to the risk-breakers, seeking missions dangerous enough to match his death wish, hoping that eventually a target would prove fast enough or lucky enough to end the suffering that waking each day represented. But he proved too skilled to die easily, and gradually, over years of missions that should have killed him but didn't, something resembling purpose replaced the raw wound of loss. He would hunt down threats to innocent people, eliminate dangers before they could create more widows and orphans, become the weapon that prevented other families from experiencing what he had endured. It was not healing, not really, but it was survival disguised as meaning, and that proved sufficient to keep him functional. This was the story Ashley believed, the narrative that defined him, the past that explained his present and shaped his future. But it was also, in ways he was only beginning to suspect, a carefully constructed lie. The truth was darker, more complicated, and infinitely more disturbing than the fiction he had been taught to remember. Whether his memories were entirely false, or whether they represented distorted fragments of actual events, would remain ambiguous, a question that the story itself would refuse to answer definitively. But that truth would only reveal itself gradually, piece by terrible piece, as Ashley descended into Lea Monde and discovered that the worst horrors sometimes wear familiar faces and speak in voices we trust. The manor of Duke Aldous Byron Bardorba stood in the Graylands, a region of Valendia characterized by mist-shrouded hills and forests where light seemed reluctant to penetrate too deeply, as if the land itself remembered ancient conflicts and preferred the shadows that allowed ambiguity. The Duke was a figure of considerable power within Parliament, a hero from the Civil War whose military genius had helped determine which families would retain influence and which would be broken. His political acumen matched his tactical brilliance, allowing him to navigate the treacherous currents of post-war governance with the same skill he had displayed on battlefields. He maintained extensive networks of informants, cultivated relationships with both secular and religious authorities, and generally operated with the cautious paranoia of someone who understood exactly how fragile political power truly was. On a particular winter evening, as snow fell softly outside and fires burned in every hearth, Duke Bardorba's manor became the site of an incident that would eventually topple governments and reshape Valendia's balance of power. Mullenkamp cultists, led by their enigmatic prophet Sydney Losstarot, attacked the estate with a precision that suggested extensive planning and inside intelligence. They moved through the Duke's defences with unsettling ease, neutralizing guards and servants with methods that ranged from conventional violence to applications of power that witnesses would struggle to describe coherently. Their objective, according to intelligence that reached VKB headquarters within hours, was to find something, some artifact or objective that would serve purposes unclear to outside observers. The VKP responded by dispatching Ashley Riot, their most reliable operative, accompanied by Calo Merlos, an agent from the Inquisitor's division, whose analytical skills complemented Ashley's direct action capabilities. Their orders were straightforward: assess the situation, protect Duke Bardorba if possible, capture or eliminate Sydney Losstarot, and recover the Duke's young son Joshua if the boy had been taken hostage. Standard risk-breaker protocol applied. Ashley would work alone in the field, with Calo providing support from secure positions, and neither would acknowledge VKP involvement if captured or killed. They were deniable assets, ghosts who officially did not exist, perfect tools for operations where failure could not be traced back to parliamentary authority. The Order of the Crimson Blades also responded to intelligence about the Mullenkamp attack, but their involvement was unauthorized, undertaken without Parliament's knowledge or consent. Romeo Guildenstern, the Order's field commander, and Cardinal Batistum's most trusted agent, recognized opportunity when it presented itself. If Sydney Losstarot was indeed at Duke Bardorba's manor, if the cult leader was focused on some objective that required his personal attention, then this represented a chance to capture the heretic and claim whatever secrets he possessed. The Cardinal had been researching Lea Monde's dark powers for years, seeking the immortality that ancient texts promised to those who mastered the dark. Guildenstern shared his master's ambition, though perhaps not his willingness to share the fruits of that ambition. The commander assembled his elite troops and marched on the Bardorba estate without requesting the authorization that Parliament would certainly have denied. Ashley infiltrated the manor through methods he had perfected over years of similar operations, moving through shadows and exploiting gaps in attention that even well-trained guards inevitably created. He witnessed Mullenkamp cultists searching rooms with systematic thoroughness, overheard fragments of conversation about keys and powers and the dark, observed evidence of violence both conventional and distinctly less so. Bodies lay in corridors, but some of them had been killed by weapons Ashley did not recognize, methods that left burns or wounds that physics should not have permitted. The cult employed forces beyond mere martial skill, and that realization added layers of complication to what should have been a straightforward operation. He found Sydney Losstarot in one of the manor's central chambers, a space that had clearly been Duke Bardorba's private study, surrounded by books that spoke to the Duke's intellectual interests and artifacts that suggested connections to history most modern scholars preferred to ignore. Sydney was beautiful in ways that transcended conventional attractiveness, possessing features so delicate and graceful that gender became almost irrelevant in the face of his otherworldly presence. He stood motionless, examining something on the Duke's desk, seemingly unconcerned that armed men were hunting him through the building. His hands and legs were prosthetic, crafted from an exotic metal called hagane, designed with clawed fingers that suggested functionality beyond normal human requirements. He wore minimal clothing, exposing his torso and the elaborate tattoo that covered his back, a symbol that Ashley did not recognize, but which radiated significance beyond mere decoration. Their eyes met, and Ashley felt something shift in the air, as if reality itself had tilted slightly off its normal axis. Sydney smiled, an expression of genuine pleasure, as if Ashley's arrival was exactly what he had been hoping for. Before Ashley could announce his authority or make any demands, Sydney moved, not with the awkward gait of someone wearing prosthetics, but with fluid grace that suggested the artificial limbs were extensions of his will, rather than mechanical replacements. He closed the distance between them faster than normal human reflexes could process, and for a moment Ashley thought the mission would end before it truly began. But Sydney was not attacking, merely observing, studying Ashley with an intensity that felt invasive, as if the cult leader could see past skin and bone into something deeper and more essential. He spoke in a voice that carried layers of meaning beyond the simple words, commenting on Ashley's strength and dedication, asking strange questions about where his soul had gone, noting qualities in the risk-breaker that apparently satisfied some criteria Sydney had established for purposes Ashley could not fathom. Then, before Ashley could respond or react, Sydney summoned a creature that mythology insisted could not exist in the modern age, a wyvern of the sort that belonged in fairy tales rather than parliamentary missions, and used the monster as both weapon and distraction. The battle that followed tested everything Ashley had learned in his years as a risk breaker. The Wyvern moved with reptilian speed and aerial advantages that made conventional combat tactics useless. It breathed poison, struck with claws capable of shredding armor, and demonstrated intelligence that suggested this was not mere beast, but something more dangerous and less predictable. Ashley fought with the mechanical precision that characterized all his operations, exploiting openings, targeting vulnerabilities, treating the monster as simply another problem requiring lethal solution. But even as he fought, part of his mind processed what Sydney's ability to summon such a creature implied about the cult leader's power and the nature of the dark that Mullenkamp worshipped. When the Wyvern finally fell, when Ashley stood victorious amid the wreckage of Duke Bardorba's study, with ichor splattered across his armor and adrenaline still flooding his system, he discovered that Sydney had departed, vanished while Ashley was occupied with the monster that had been both weapon and deliberate distraction. But the cult leader had not fled randomly. Before disappearing, he had taken Duke Bardorba's young son Joshua, a child who represented the Duke's greatest vulnerability, and he had left behind a clue, words spoken loud enough for Ashley to overhear before the Wyvern's summoning had forced full attention to immediate survival. Sydney was taking Joshua to Lea Monde, to the cursed city that officially was abandoned, but which clearly still held significance for those who understood what powers slept within its ruins. The Graylands incident, as it would later be known in official reports, concluded with Duke Bardorba's manor burning, casualties on all sides, Joshua in cultist hands, and Sydney Losstarot demonstrating abilities that shattered comfortable assumptions about magic's disappearance from the modern world. Guildenstern and his Crimson Blades had arrived in time to witness the fire, but too late to intercept Sydney. Ashley had failed to capture or kill the primary target, and failed to recover the kidnapped child, though in fairness, no one had anticipated that the target would possess supernatural capabilities or tactical awareness sufficient to escape while occupying a skilled operative with a legendary monster. The mission was, by any objective standard, a disaster, the sort of catastrophic failure that ended careers and generated extensive investigations into what had gone wrong and who should be held accountable. But Ashley was not thinking about investigations or career consequences. He was remembering Sydney's final words before the Wyvern's summoning, the destination that the cult leader had announced as if inviting pursuit rather than attempting to conceal his route. Lea Monde, the Dark City, the cursed ruin that both Parliament and Church studied in secret, while pretending publicly that it posed no threat. Sydney was going to Lea Monde, taking Joshua there for purposes that could only be sinister, and Ashley understood with absolute clarity that his mission had not ended, but merely changed location. He would follow Sydney into the cursed city. He would rescue Joshua and complete his original objective of eliminating the cult leader. And if that meant venturing into a place where the dead refused to die and the dark still held power, then he would adapt his tactics accordingly, because risk breakers did not abandon missions simply because circumstances became complicated. Calo Merlot tried to argue against immediate pursuit, suggesting that Ashley should report to VKB headquarters, await reinforcement and proper authorization, proceed through channels rather than rushing into a situation without adequate intelligence or support. Her concerns were valid from a procedural standpoint, grounded in training that emphasized coordination and proper chain of command. But Ashley was no longer thinking like an agent following protocols. He was thinking like a man driven by the memory of failure, who had internalized the narrative of losing his family and who saw in Joshua another innocent endangered by forces that needed stopping. Delay was not caution but cowardice in his calculus, and Ashley would not make the same mistake twice. He left for Lea Monde immediately, pausing only to gather supplies and weapons appropriate for extended operations in hostile territory. Callow accompanied him despite her misgivings, recognizing that Ashley would proceed regardless of whether he had backup and determining that his chances improved marginally with support, however inadequate she felt her combat skills to be. They traveled through the night, following the route that intelligence suggested Sydney would take, moving through countryside where mist gathered thick enough to limit visibility, and every shadow seemed to conceal potential threat. Neither spoke much during the journey, each occupied with private thoughts about what awaited them in the cursed city, each processing their own fears and doubts in the silence that stretched between them. As they approached Lea Monde, as the cursed city's silhouette emerged from morning mist, like a ghost materializing from collective nightmare, Ashley felt something change within his consciousness, a subtle shift that he would not fully understand until much later. The whirlpools surrounding the isolated landmass churned with violence that made direct approach impossible, forcing them to find the secret entrance through the wine cellars, tunnels that had been carved centuries earlier and which remained accessible to those who knew where to look. As they descended into darkness, lit only by torches whose flames seemed reluctant to burn too brightly, Ashley crossed a threshold he did not recognize, stepping from the world he understood into a place where reality operated according to rules he had not been taught, and where the past, he believed, would be systematically questioned, though never definitively answered. The wine cellars of Lea Monde stretched beneath the cursed city like the roots of a poison tree, chambers and passages carved from limestone over centuries, designed to maintain the precise temperature and humidity that vintners required for their craft. Barrels still lined the walls, their contents long since turned to vinegar or evaporated entirely, but their presence testified to the prosperity that Lea Monde had once enjoyed. This had been a working city, a thriving community where people lived complete lives, not simply a mystical site devoted to dark powers. The wine had been famous throughout Valendia, prized by nobles who paid premium prices for bottles bearing Lea Monde labels, vintages that connoisseurs claimed possessed qualities no modern vintner could replicate. But 25 years of abandonment had transformed these cellars from industrial facility into tomb. Corpses lay scattered throughout the chambers, bodies that had never been properly buried, flesh long since rotted away, but bones remaining as testimony to the earthquake's devastation. Some of these skeletons clutched wine bottles, suggesting they had sought refuge in the cellars when the shaking began, hoping that underground would offer protection that surface structures could not provide. The hope had proven false. Sections of ceiling had collapsed, crushing those beneath, and even those who avoided immediate death had found themselves trapped, slowly dying from injury or thirst, while the world above burned and no rescue came. Ashley moved through this charnel house with the detachment that years as a risk-breaker had cultivated, treating bodies as environmental obstacles rather than as evidence of human tragedy. He had learned early in his career that empathy was luxury that fieldwork could not afford, that allowing himself to feel too deeply about the suffering his missions exposed would paralyze him at moments when hesitation meant death. So he stepped over skeletons, examined walls for structural integrity, and focused on the tactical problem of navigating an unfamiliar underground network with minimal mapping resources and the constant awareness that Sydney might have left traps or guardians in passages he knew pursuers would need to use. The first indication that Lea Monde was not simply an abandoned ruin came when one of those skeletons moved. The corpse that had been lying motionless against a wine barrel suddenly animated, rising to its feet with movements that physics should not have permitted, bones held together by forces that exceeded simple muscle and tendon. Hollow eye sockets fixed on Ashley with awareness that suggested this was not random reanimation, but directed action, and the skeleton attacked with purpose that belied its lack of brain or nervous system. Ashley destroyed it efficiently, reducing bones to fragments too small to pose further threat. But the encounter confirmed intelligence reports about incomplete death and the Dark's power to animate the dead within Lea Monde's boundaries. More animated corpses appeared as Ashley progressed deeper into the wine cellars, each one requiring combat that depleted his energy and resources incrementally, death by 1,000 cuts from opponents who should not exist. But these undead were merely the beginning, the weakest manifestation of the Dark's influence. Deeper in the cellars, where ancient passages intersected newer construction in ways that suggested deliberate architectural planning rather than organic growth, Ashley encountered creatures that belonged in nightmare rather than reality. Phantoms that existed partially in physical space and partially in dimensions his senses could not perceive. Possessed suits of armor that moved with coordination impossible for empty metal shells. Imps and goblins that capered and mocked before attacking with abilities that conventional understanding insisted they could not wield. Each encounter forced Ashley to question assumptions about the world he thought he understood. Magic was supposed to have faded from Ivalice, relegated to legend and superstition, yet here it manifested with undeniable physicality. The dead were supposed to remain dead, yet corpses rose to fight with determination that exceeded many living soldiers he had faced. Reality itself seemed negotiable within Lea Monde's boundaries, as if the rules governing normal existence had been suspended or rewritten, according to principles that predated modern philosophy's comfortable certainties. Ashley adapted because adaptation was what risk-breakers did, treating each impossible thing as simply another tactical problem requiring lethal solution. But beneath his professional composure, seeds of doubt had been planted about the nature of the world and his own place within it. The wine cellars eventually opened into broader passages, ancient Kiltine construction that predated the cellars by centuries. Carved when Lea Monde had been young, and the priestess Millenkamp had walked streets that now lay in ruins above. These passages bore inscriptions in languages Ashley did not recognize, symbols that seemed to shift when observed directly but stabilized when viewed peripherally, as if they existed on the edge of perception rather than fully in normal space. Some inscriptions glowed with faint luminescence that provided light where torches should have been necessary, while others seemed to absorb illumination, creating patches of darkness so absolute that they appeared to be holes cut into reality itself. In one chamber decorated with particularly elaborate inscriptions, Ashley discovered what Callow identified as a grimoire, a tome of ancient magic bound in materials that analysis insisted were organic, but which no contemporary scholar could identify. The book lay on a pedestal, as if waiting for someone to claim it, and when Ashley approached, text appeared on pages that had seemed blank, script that he could somehow read despite never having studied the language in which it was written. The grimoire taught him spells, applications of magical force that would allow him to harm enemies, or heal wounds, or alter probability in subtle ways that could mean the difference between survival and death. The knowledge entered his mind not as learned information, but as something he was remembering, as if these abilities had always been accessible and merely needed the right stimulus to resurface. This phenomenon disturbed Ashley more than the animated corpses or the impossible creatures. Skills he had never studied were appearing in his consciousness, and he found himself executing techniques he had never practiced, moving in combat with fluidity that exceeded his formal training. The obvious explanation, uncomfortable as it was, suggested that something within Lea Monde was awakening abilities Ashley had possessed all along, powers that had been suppressed or forgotten, but which remained part of who he fundamentally was. Whether these were natural talents enhanced by the dark or artificial capabilities implanted by the VKP remained unclear, another question without definitive answer. As he progressed through Lea Monde's Undercity, Ashley began experiencing visions, flashes of scenes and perspectives that could not be his own memories. He would suddenly see through different eyes, witnessing events occurring in other parts of the cursed city, observing conversations between people he had never met. He saw Callow's journey through different sections of Lea Monde, watched her interactions with Sydney's Lieutenant John Hardin and young Joshua, learned things he should not be able to know through any normal means. He saw through the eyes of Samantha, Romeo Guildenstern's lover and second in command, experiencing her devotion to the Crimson Blade commander and her growing doubts about the methods he employed. These experiences occurred without Ashley's conscious control or understanding. They simply happened, flooding his awareness with information and perspectives that should have been inaccessible, providing intelligence that proved tactically valuable even as it raised disturbing questions about what was happening to his mind and why the dark seemed to be particularly interested in him. The phenomenon suggested that Ashley possessed some innate affinity for these powers, some quality that marked him as different from ordinary people who could not experience such visions even within Lea Monde's boundaries. Calomerlos, meanwhile, navigated her own path through Lea Monde's ruins, her investigation taking her along routes that paralleled Ashley's journey without directly intersecting. She was a skilled interrogator, trained to read body language and vocal patterns, to extract information through methods that ranged from gentle persuasion to techniques that Parliament officially did not acknowledge its agents employed. Her mission parameters differed slightly from Ashley's. Where he focused on eliminating Sydney and recovering Joshua, she was tasked with gathering intelligence about Mullenkamp's objectives and capabilities, determining whether the cult represented localized threat or the vanguard of something larger and more dangerous. Her path brought her into contact with Sydney's second-in-command, a man named John Hardin, whose devotion to the cult leader appeared absolute, who spoke of Sydney with reverence that suggested religious faith rather than simple loyalty to a commanding officer. Hardin was escorting young Joshua through the city, treating the child with surprising gentleness despite his role as kidnapper, and Callow saw opportunity to extract information while perhaps negotiating Joshua's release. The conversation that followed revealed layers to Mullenkamp's agenda that official reports had not captured. Details about prophecies and chosen vessels that Callow struggled to process into actionable intelligence. Hardin spoke of Sydney not as terrorist or heretic, but as prophet, someone who understood truths about the dark and humanity's relationship with fundamental forces that both Parliament and Church had forgotten or deliberately suppressed. According to Hardin, Lea Monde was not cursed but sacred, a place where the barrier between physical reality and deeper truths grew thin enough that those with proper understanding could perceive what normally remained hidden. The city's destruction had been tragedy, but it had also created conditions necessary for purposes that Hardin would not fully explain. As for Joshua, Hardin suggested the boy was significant not for who he was, but for what he represented, his bloodline carrying importance that would only become clear as events unfolded. The kidnapping had not been random act of violence but calculated move in a larger game, whose rules Callow was only beginning to perceive. Sydney needed Joshua at specific locations within Lea Monde, places where the dark concentrated with particular intensity, though the exact purpose remained frustratingly vague in Hardin's explanations. This intelligence, fragmentary and incomplete as it was, painted a picture significantly more complex than the simple cult activity that VKP briefings had described. Millenkamp was not merely a heretical sect worshipping forbidden powers, but an organization pursuing specific objectives that required extensive historical knowledge and meticulous planning. Whatever Sydney intended to accomplish in Lea Monde, it involved careful manipulation of multiple factors, including bloodlines, locations, and the presence of individuals whose capabilities matched criteria that Sydney had established through means Callow could not determine. Ashley was clearly one such individual, his pursuit anticipated and perhaps even deliberately engineered by a cult leader who seemed to be orchestrating events rather than simply reacting to Parliament's countermeasures. While Ashley and Callow navigated the cursed city's lower levels, Romeo Guildenstern led his Crimson Blades through a more direct assault on Lea Monde's surface structures. The commander was a figure of compelling contradictions, a Shahid warrior who quoted classical literature while executing heretics, a devout servant of the church who pursued personal ambitions that Cardinal Batistum might not entirely approve if he understood their full scope. Guildenstern believed absolutely in his own exceptionalism. His conviction that he was destined for greatness so profound that it shaped every decision and colored every interaction. He spoke in elaborate soliloquies even when addressing subordinates, his language formal to the point of archaism, as if he existed in a play where proper dialogue required elevation above common speech. His forces established themselves in the town centre, a district where Lea Monde's middle classes had once conducted daily business, shopping in markets that now stood empty, and conducting trade in shops whose goods had long since been looted or rotted away. The Crimson Blades secured key structures, established patrol routes, and began methodical searches for anything that might lead them to Sydney or reveal the secrets that Cardinal Batistum coveted. They encountered the same undead and monsters that Ashley faced in the depths, but Guildenstern commanded sufficient forces that these threats could be overwhelmed through concentrated firepower, rather than requiring the individual combat excellence that Ashley employed in his solitary operations. Among Guildenstern's subordinates, one stood apart in both skill and relationship to the commander. Samantha was everything a Crimson Blade should be, devoted to the church, skilled in combat, unwavering in her execution of orders. But she was also Guildenstern's lover, their relationship violating regulations that prohibited fraternization within the order's ranks, and her devotion to him personally sometimes conflicted with her duty to the organization he served. She watched him with an adoration that bordered on worship, seeing in his grand ambitions and elaborate speeches not arrogance, but the rightful confidence of someone destined to reshape Valendia's balance of power. But Samantha also possessed the clarity that love sometimes provides, the ability to see the beloved's flaws even while accepting them. She recognized that Guildenstern's ambition was consuming him, that his pursuit of immortality and power had become an obsession that overwhelmed other considerations, including the genuine faith that had once motivated his service to the church. She saw how he treated his subordinates as expendable resources, how he calculated outcomes in terms that reduced human lives to numerical values in strategic equations. She understood that the man she loved was walking a path that would ultimately destroy him, and she found herself torn between the loyalty that demanded she follow him anywhere and the growing certainty that following him into Lea Monde's depths would cost her everything. As Guildenstern's forces penetrated deeper into the cursed city, they encountered obstacles that conventional military force could not easily overcome. The dark responded to their presence, manifesting with increasing hostility, as if Lea Monde itself resented the Crimson Blade's intrusion and sought to expel invaders who came seeking to exploit powers they did not understand. Undead grew more numerous and more aggressive. Monsters attacked with coordination that suggested intelligent direction rather than animal instinct. The very architecture of the city seemed to shift. Passages closing that had been open moments before. New routes appearing that led into ambushes or traps clearly designed by something with tactical awareness and hostile intent. The Crimson Blade suffered casualties at rates that Guildenstern had not anticipated when planning the operation. Men died to monsters they could not effectively fight with conventional weapons. Entire squads disappeared into sections of the city and were never seen again, their fates unknown but presumed terrible, based on the screams that occasionally echoed through abandoned streets. The commander ordered his remaining forces to consolidate, establishing defensive positions that could be held against the increasing supernatural assault, while he personally pursued objectives that required someone of his exceptional capabilities to accomplish. Those personal objectives led Guildenstern into the city's central cathedral, the Temple of Kiltia, a massive structure that had served as the spiritual heart of ancient Lea Monde before the earthquake transformed thriving city into haunted ruin. The cathedral's architecture testified to the faith and skill of its builders. Soaring arches that seemed to defy gravity, stained glass windows that somehow remained intact despite 25 years of abandonment. Chambers designed to create acoustic effects that made even whispered prayers resonate with power. This had been a place of genuine worship, where the original priestess Mullenkamp had conducted rituals and taught disciples, where generations of Kiltine faithful had sought communion with the dark and found not corruption, but enlightenment. Deep within the cathedral's restricted sections, in chambers accessible only to the highest ranks of the ancient priesthood, Guildenstern discovered what both he and Sydney had been seeking. An artifact of immense power, though its exact nature remained somewhat ambiguous even to those who laid eyes upon it. What was clear was that this object represented a crystallization of Lea Monde's accumulated dark energies, something that ancient texts suggested could serve as key to mastering the city's full power. The object appeared suspended in stasis through magical workings that had survived the city's destruction, waiting for someone worthy to claim it. The artifact called to Guildenstern with promises of everything his ambition craved: power that would elevate him above normal human limitations, authority that would command respect through capability rather than mere rank, the ability to transcend his current constraints and become something exceptional not just by comparison to others, but in absolute terms. He reached for it, believing that his determination and skill made him worthy, that his years of service and his tactical brilliance qualified him to wield such power. Sydney arrived as Guildenstern's fingers touched the artifact, appearing in the cathedral chamber through methods that might have been simple walking or might have involved abilities that exceeded normal physical movement. The cult leader's expression combined amusement and something that might have been disappointment, as if Guildenstern was performing exactly as predicted, but that prediction reflected poorly on the commander's judgment. Sydney spoke of worthiness, of how such artifacts could only be properly wielded by those whose spiritual nature matched specific criteria, whose essence resonated with the dark in ways that could not be faked or forced through mere determination. Guildenstern possessed ambition and skill, Sydney acknowledged, considerable talent that would serve him well in conventional pursuits, but he lacked the fundamental quality necessary to become true vessel for powers of this magnitude. The artifact required something innate, some aspect of spiritual architecture that existed independent of training or effort, and Guildenstern simply did not possess it. The rejection was not moral judgment, but simple incompatibility, like trying to force a key into a lock it was never designed to open. The conversation that followed revealed tensions and philosophies that had been building for years in the conflict between Iocus and Kiltine traditions. Sydney represented an understanding of the dark as natural force, neither good nor evil, but simply fundamental to existence, something to be studied and respected rather than feared and suppressed. Guildenstern embodied the Church's position that such powers were inherently corrupting, that humanity's proper relationship with supernatural forces involved worship of approved deities rather than personal mastery of primal energies. Each saw the other as heretic or fool, and neither was particularly interested in finding common ground when absolute positions remained theoretically defensible. But theoretical positions and practical capability were not identical, as Guildenstern discovered. When he attempted to forcibly claim what Sydney warned he could not properly wield. The artifact responded to his touch, but not in the way the commander had anticipated or desired. Instead of granting him power, it rejected him violently, releasing energies that burned rather than empowered, that punished his presumption rather than rewarding his ambition. Guildenstern screamed as forces he was not equipped to handle flooded through him, searing patterns into his being that were configured for very different spiritual architecture than his own. Sydney watched this with something approaching sympathy, recognizing Guildenstern suffering the price that ambition demanded when it exceeded wisdom or natural capability. The cult leader could have allowed the artifact's rejection to kill the Crimson Blade commander, could have eliminated a rival through simple inaction, but instead he intervened, pulling Guildenstern away before the exposure proved fatal. The gesture was not mercy so much as pragmatism, mixed with something that might have been respect for determination, even when that determination was fundamentally misdirected. Guildenstern would survive. Sydney's intervention ensured that, but he would carry wounds from the contact, damage to his sense of self that would prove more devastating than any physical injury. As Sydney departed, leaving Guildenstern collapsed and broken in the cathedral chamber, the cult leader spoke words that would haunt the commander through everything that followed. Sydney suggested that worthiness was not something that could be claimed through force or ambition, that certain powers chose their vessels according to criteria that mortal understanding could not easily pass, that Guildenstern's failure revealed not weakness, but simply fundamental mismatch between what he was and what wielding such power required. The artifact had found its proper bearer, Sydney implied, someone whose nature matched what it needed, someone who was even now being tested and prepared through trials calibrated to awaken dormant capabilities. Ashley Riot's name was never spoken in this conversation, but both Sydney and Guildenstern understood who the cult leader meant. The risk-breaker pursuing Sydney through Lea Monde's depths was not simply a skilled operative doing his duty, but a key piece in whatever Sydney had been orchestrating. Ashley was being prepared, systematically exposed to the dark in controlled doses, his abilities awakened through combat and through the strange visions he experienced, his certainties about his own identity gradually eroded in ways that might prepare him for transformation that his current self could not imagine or accept. Guildenstern dragged himself from the cathedral floor, his body shaking with aftershocks from the artifact's rejection, his mind processing the implications of what Sydney had revealed. If Ashley was the worthy vessel, if the riskbreaker was being prepared to wield Lea Monde's full power, then eliminating Ashley became imperative regardless of political complications or the difficulty of targeting a fellow agent of Valendia's government. Guildenstern had come to the cursed city seeking power for himself, but if he could not possess it, he would ensure that no one else claimed it either. Better to destroy everything, collapse the entire island into the lake, kill everyone within its boundaries, including himself, if necessary, than allow Sydney's plans to reach fruition. This decision marked a turning point in the commander's psychology, a transition from ambitious servant of the church to something darker and more desperate. The artifact's rejection had wounded more than just his body. It had shattered his fundamental conception of himself as exceptional and destined for greatness, and that psychological injury proved more devastating than physical harm. Guildenstern had defined himself through his exceptionalism, his conviction that he possessed qualities that elevated him above common humanity. The rejection revealed him as merely talented, merely human, merely limited in ways that effort could not overcome. The revelation broke something inside him, transformed determination into obsession, strategy into desperate need to prevent anyone else from achieving what he had been denied. Samantha found him in the cathedral, having followed when he failed to return from his personal investigation, and she immediately recognized that something fundamental had changed in the man she loved. The confidence that had always characterized Guildenstern's bearing had been replaced by something frantic, a manic energy that spoke of plans formed in desperation rather than careful strategy. He spoke rapidly about Ashley Riot and Sydney's intentions and the necessity of preventing powers from falling into wrong hands. And Samantha listened with growing horror as she realized that her lover was preparing to commit actions that could not be walked back or justified. She tried to reason with him, to pull him back from the edge he was approaching, but Guildenstern was beyond reason at this point. The rejection had pushed him into psychological territory, where logic and consequence no longer constrained his decisions. He issued orders to his remaining Crimson Blades, commanding them to hunt down the riskbreaker, to eliminate the threat that Ashley represented, regardless of the political complications such action would create. The Church's forces were being directed to murder a Parliament agent, an act that could reignite civil conflict if it became widely known. But Guildenstern no longer cared about such considerations. As these surface conflicts escalated, as Guildenstern descended further into obsession, and Samantha struggled with loyalty that was leading her toward actions she increasingly doubted, Ashley continued his journey through Lea Monde's depths, unaware that he had become target rather than hunter. His path led him through the Snowfly Forest, a section of the city where nature had reclaimed territory that civilization once controlled. Trees growing through buildings and roots cracking foundation stones, creating landscape that was simultaneously urban ruin and primeval woodland. Snow fell constantly here despite the season being wrong for such weather, creating blanket of white that muffled sound and reduced visibility. The forest earned its name from creatures that inhabited it, insects that appeared as glowing motes of light, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. The snowflies were not natural organisms, but manifestations of the dark, spirits given physical form through processes that ancient Kiltin texts described, but which modern science insisted could not occur. They swarmed in clouds that could overwhelm the unprepared, attacked anything living that entered their territory, and demonstrated coordination that suggested hive intelligence, or perhaps singular controlling consciousness distributed across thousands of individual bodies, between encounters with monsters and undead, between the strange visions and moments of relative peace. Ashley found himself thinking about Sydney and the cult leader's comments at Duke Bardorba's manor. Sydney had looked at him with recognition, as if seeing someone familiar despite their having never met before, and had asked peculiar questions about where Ashley's soul had gone. The implications were disturbing when examined carefully. If Sydney had knowledge of Ashley beyond what simple intelligence gathering could provide, if the cult leader had been expecting specifically Ashley Riot's involvement, then the entire sequence of events might be elaborate setup rather than reactive chase. This suspicion was reinforced when Ashley encountered John Harden in the Snowfly Forest, Sydney's lieutenant intercepting him at a location that suggested careful positioning rather than random meeting. Harden fought with skill that matched Ashley's own, wielding blades with grace that spoke to extensive training, demonstrating capabilities that clearly drew on supernatural enhancement. The battle tested everything Ashley had learned, neither man able to gain decisive advantage, and eventually they reached implicit agreement to disengage rather than continue fighting to mutual exhaustion. Before departing, Harden spoke words clearly intended to unsettle, comments about Ashley's true nature and questions about whether the risk-breaker understood who he really was beneath the identity he had been given. According to Harden, Ashley was not simply a skilled operative but something more, someone whose capabilities exceeded normal human limits for reasons that had nothing to do with VKP training. The memories that defined Ashley's identity, particularly the traumatic loss of his family, might not be authentic experiences, but rather constructions designed to shape him into a particular kind of weapon. Ashley wanted to dismiss these claims as psychological warfare, attempts to create doubt and hesitation, but inconsistencies he had been noticing in his own memories. The way details kept shifting when he tried to recall specifics about Tia and Marco lent Harden's accusations uncomfortable credibility. The questions were vertiginous, threatening to undermine psychological foundations that allowed him to function, and Ashley forced himself to table them for later consideration, to focus on immediate mission requirements rather than engaging with existential uncertainties that promised only paralysis. The deeper Ashley progressed into the cursed city, the more frequently he experienced encounters with figures who seemed to know more about him than strangers should. These individuals would appear at locations where Ashley needed specific information or where his visions required interpretation, providing guidance that proved valuable even as it raised questions about motivations and allegiances. They spoke of his capabilities as if familiar with them, commented on his potential in ways that suggested long observation, and consistently implied that what Ashley believed about himself was incomplete or deliberately misleading. Through these fragmentary encounters and his own growing awareness, Ashley began piecing together a picture that was deeply unsettling. His clairvoyant experiences were not random manifestations, but evidence of abilities he had always possessed, talents that suggested he was naturally attuned to the dark in ways most humans were not. The skills appearing in his consciousness were not entirely new acquisitions, but recovered capabilities, as if he had been capable of wielding these powers all along, but something had suppressed or obscured them. And the memories that defined his identity, particularly the tragedy that motivated his service as risk-breaker, might be fabrications designed to create specific psychological profile. These revelations painted a picture that Ashley found increasingly difficult to dismiss. The VKP might have programs for creating enhanced operatives, methods that combine psychological conditioning with other techniques to produce agents whose effectiveness exceeded normal human limits. Ashley could be a product of such programs, his memories and identity carefully crafted to produce someone with specific capabilities and motivations. The manufactured trauma of losing Tia and Marco would provide drive, while the implanted guilt ensured compliance with authority figures who could frame their orders as opportunities for redemption. The psychological weight of these possibilities might have broken Ashley completely, if not for the discipline that Riskbreaker training had instilled. Whatever the truth about his memories and identity, whatever manipulation he might have endured, he remained functionally capable of executing his mission. Joshua was still in danger, Sydney still needed to be stopped, and personal crises could be addressed after operational objectives were achieved. So Ashley compartmentalized, placing doubts and questions into mental containers that could be examined later, focusing his conscious attention on tactical considerations and immediate threats. As Ashley fought through the town centre and into the cathedral district, as he overcame challenges that grew progressively more difficult, he began noticing changes in himself that went beyond simply acquiring new abilities. His physical capabilities were increasing at rates that seemed impossible, strength and speed developing in ways that suggested more than adaptation to extreme conditions. His connection to the dark was deepening, allowing him to perceive aspects of reality that remained invisible to normal human senses. And his affinity for the powers suffusing Lea Monde was becoming more pronounced, resonating with the ancient energies in ways that made him increasingly capable of wielding them. Through his visions, Ashley witnessed Guildenstern's descent into obsessive determination. The Crimson Blade commander had moved past merely wanting to capture Sydney or claim the city's powers for the church. He now sought destruction, scorched earth response that prioritized preventing enemy victory over achieving any positive objective. Guildenstern deployed his remaining forces with recklessness that suggested he no longer cared about casualties or consequences, throwing men into situations that guaranteed death in exchange for minimal tactical advantages. Samantha watched this transformation with growing alarm and heartbreak, recognizing that the man she loved was destroying himself in pursuit of goals that had become detached from rational foundation. She tried to reason with him, to pull him back from the edge, but Guildenstern was beyond her reach now, so consumed by his need to prevent Ashley's ascension that nothing else registered as important. The other Crimson Blades looked to Samantha for guidance, recognizing that their commander was no longer capable of sound decision-making, hoping that she would intervene. But Samantha found herself paralyzed by competing loyalties and emotions, unable to betray the man she loved, even as she recognized that following him further meant contributing to catastrophe. Ashley's path finally brought him to the Grand Cathedral's deepest chambers, places where even ancient Kiltin priests had ventured only for the most sacred rituals, spaces designed to concentrate the dark to intensities that required careful preparation to survive. Here, in rooms carved from bedrock and inscribed with symbols that seemed to writhe when observed directly, Sydney waited with young Joshua and Duke Bardorba himself. The Duke's presence was unexpected, raising questions about whether he had been captured separately or whether his role in these events was more complex than simple victim. Sydney greeted Ashley with the same unsettling combination of warmth and purpose that had characterized their first meeting. The cult leader spoke of being pleased that Ashley had survived the trials, that the Riskbreaker's progress through Lea Monde had demonstrated qualities that mere speculation could not confirm. Sydney explained that everything that had transpired was leading to this moment, that Ashley's presence here was not accident, but the culmination of preparations that had required extensive time and planning to arrange. Before Ashley could demand explanations or attempt to take Joshua by force, Sydney revealed a truth that recontextualized everything. Duke Bardorba was Sydney's father. Their relationship biological rather than metaphorical or adoptive. Decades earlier, Bardorba had participated in Kiltine rituals seeking power and longevity that the dark promised to those who understood its nature. Those rituals had produced Sydney, a being that was simultaneously Bardorba's son and something more than simply human. Someone who inherited his father's bloodline while being shaped by forces that transcended normal genetics. Sydney had lived for decades, sustained by the dark in a state that was neither quite mortal nor fully transcendent. He had gathered followers who recognized in him someone who understood truths about humanity's relationship with fundamental forces that both church and parliament had forgotten. He had studied ancient texts and practiced abilities that modern Valendia considered impossible, preparing for transformations that would require very specific conditions and very particular participants to accomplish. According to Sydney, Ashley had been selected for his role through processes that combined recognition of innate capability with careful observation and preparation. Whether Ashley's entire life had been orchestrated by Sydney, or whether the cult leader had simply recognized and exploited capabilities that Ashley naturally possessed, remained deliberately ambiguous in Sydney's explanation. What was clear was that Ashley possessed qualities necessary for what Sydney intended: spiritual architecture that matched specific requirements, potential that could be awakened through proper stimulation and challenge. Sydney spoke of transformation, of completing a process that would allow Ashley to transcend normal human limitations and become vessel for powers that the modern age had forgotten how to wield. The artifact that Guildenstern had failed to claim, that had rejected the commander's attempt at force mastery, would accept Ashley because his fundamental nature matched what it required. By accepting this transformation, Ashley would gain capabilities sufficient to resist any further manipulation, strength to protect those he chose to protect, knowledge to understand what had been done to him and why. The offer was seductive precisely because it acknowledged Ashley's rage while providing channel through which that rage could be transformed into effective action. Sydney was not asking Ashley to forgive manipulation or accept that it had been justified. He was offering tools for ensuring it could never happen again, means by which Ashley could achieve genuine autonomy that his current existence denied him. It was manipulation, obviously, a final layer of psychological leverage designed to make Ashley choose the outcome Sydney wanted. But it was also potentially accurate in suggesting that accepting the transformation represented Ashley's best option for achieving self-determination. Before Ashley could respond, Guildenstern burst into the chamber accompanied by remnants of his Crimson Blade forces. The commander had finally tracked both Sydney and Ashley to this deepest sanctum, arriving with desperate energy of someone who has staked everything on final gamble. He demanded that Sydney surrender, threatened violence if compliance was not immediate, promised that the church would ensure no one would access powers that should remain forbidden. His words emerged in torrents, elaborate speeches that revealed how thoroughly his obsession had consumed his judgment. Sydney regarded Guildenstern with something that might have been pity, recognizing in the commander someone who had been broken by rejection, whose entire identity had been constructed around exceptionalism, and who could not survive discovering he was merely talented rather than genuinely special. The cult leader spoke gently, explaining that Guildenstern could not wield what he sought, that his nature did not match the requirements, that his ambitions exceeded what his fundamental being could support. These words, delivered without mockery but with sympathy, enraged Guildenstern beyond reason. He attacked Sydney directly, abandoning tactics and coordination, fighting with recklessness of someone who no longer cared whether he survived. The battle was brief and brutal. Sydney's prosthetic limbs moved with speed and precision that Guildenstern could not match, despite his considerable skill. Within moments, Guildenstern lay broken on the chamber floor, his armor cracked, his body bleeding from wounds that exceeded what normal constitution should survive. He should have died, would have died except for Samantha's intervention. Samantha had followed Guildenstern into the cathedral's depths, unable to abandon him even after recognizing that his obsession had become self-destructive madness. She positioned herself between her wounded lover and Sydney, knowing she could not defeat the cult leader, but hoping her sacrifice might buy Guildenstern time. Her devotion was absolute and tragic, love expressed through willingness to die, protecting someone who had long since stopped being worthy of such devotion. Sydney looked at her with genuine respect, recognizing in Samantha's devotion something rare and valuable. He did not kill her, could not bring himself to destroy someone whose love matched the purity of commitment he himself had demonstrated to his own purposes. Instead, he spoke to her with honesty, explaining that Guildenstern's wounds were beyond conventional healing, but that the Dark offered alternatives if she was willing to pay necessary prices. He could preserve Guildenstern, maintain him in a state sustained by forces beyond normal medicine. But doing so would require Samantha's sacrifice, her life force channeled to sustain his failing body. She accepted without hesitation, without even asking for time to consider. Her love for Guildenstern trumped all other considerations, including her own survival. Sydney performed the ritual with efficiency born from knowledge, channeling Samantha's vitality into Guildenstern's broken form, watching as the commander's wounds began closing while Samantha's body grew pale and still. She died with expression of peace, her final sight being Guildenstern breathing, because of what she had given. Guildenstern witnessed this, saw Samantha die to preserve his life, and something inside him shattered that had survived all previous damage. The artifact's rejection had wounded his ego, but Samantha's sacrifice destroyed whatever remained of his capacity for anything beyond obsessive rage. He had claimed to love her, had told himself his ambitions were partly motivated by desire to build a world where their relationship could be open. But her death, absolute proof of her devotion purchased at cost of her existence, revealed that he had never loved her as completely as she loved him, that his ambition had always exceeded his affection. The guilt was unbearable, made worse by knowledge that she had sacrificed herself to save him from consequences of his own obsession. That guilt transformed into cold fury, not the hot anger of immediate reaction, but calculated rage that fixed on Ashley Riot as target for everything he felt but could not process. This was Ashley's fault, Guildenstern decided with logic that was simultaneously absurd and emotionally coherent. If Ashley had not been Sydney's chosen vessel, if the risk-breaker had not possessed the qualities Guildenstern lacked, then none of this would have happened. Eliminating Ashley became psychological necessity rather than tactical objective. As Sydney began the ritual that would transfer power from himself to Ashley, as the dark concentrated in the chamber to intensities that made breathing difficult, Duke Bardorba finally spoke. His voice was weak, but it carried authority that decades of political power had cultivated. He addressed Sydney as son, confirming their relationship, and he spoke to Ashley as someone deserving truth. According to the Duke, Sydney's plans were indeed elaborate and long prepared, following patterns established by the original priestess Mullenkamp, executing transformations that required generations to properly arrange. The Duke had been part of this, his participation in rituals decades earlier, serving purposes he had not fully understood at the time. Sydney's birth had been the result of those rituals, producing someone who could inherit both Bardorba bloodline and affinity for the dark in combination that would allow specific capabilities. And Ashley's selection was based on qualities that made him compatible with what Sydney needed to accomplish, though whether those qualities were entirely natural or partially engineered remained deliberately unclear in the Duke's explanation. Sydney confirmed his father's account, adding that the transformation he was offering Ashley represented completion of work that had been in preparation for longer than any individual lifespan. The power was tool, certainly, but it was also key that would unlock Ashley's full potential, capabilities that had been present but dormant, waiting for proper catalyst to fully manifest. By accepting, Ashley would become something that the original Mullenkamp had envisioned when she established Lea Monde and began the long work of preparing certain bloodlines for relationship with the dark that transcended both fearful rejection and greedy exploitation. Ashley found himself in an impossible position, offered power that would transcend limitations while coming with implications that both terrified and attracted him. Accepting meant acknowledging that his life had been manipulated, that he was fulfillment of plans laid by others. Refusing meant remaining trapped in systems that had shaped him, continuing to serve powers that saw him as weapon rather than person. Either path violated something fundamental in his sense of who he was or wanted to be. What decided him was Joshua, the 4-year-old child caught in conflicts between forces that cared nothing for individual welfare, represented innocent life that needed protection. Ashley could not save himself from the web of manipulation that had defined his existence. But he could save Joshua, ensure that at least one person escaped with chance at life not predetermined by others' plans. If accepting transformation gave him power necessary to protect the child, then he would accept it for that purpose. He reached for what Sydney offered, and the moment contact was made, reality seemed to shudder. Power flooded through Ashley, not gentle acquisition, but torrential force that rewrote him at fundamental levels, restructuring his being to accommodate energies that mortal form was never designed to contain. The pain was extraordinary. The agony of transformation that required breaking before rebuilding. Death and resurrection compressed into seconds that felt eternal. Sydney watched with satisfaction and what might have been paternal pride, seeing fruits of his planning manifest as Ashley completed transition. The cult leader's own form began deteriorating as power departed, its energy no longer sustaining him. He was dying, finally and completely, but he showed no fear or regret. This had been his purpose, to serve as bridge allowing transfer from one generation to next, and he fulfilled that purpose with satisfaction of someone whose life's work reaches successful conclusion. Duke Bardorba died in the same moment, the connection between father and son severing as Sydney's life ended. The two men, whose relationship had been central to everything that transpired, expired simultaneously, their linked fates finally separated by completion of the work that had bound them. Their bodies collapsed side by side, and something that might have been reconciliation passed between them in their final moment. Guildenstern, witnessing Ashley's transformation into exactly what Sydney had promised, felt the last restraints on his sanity snap. He had lost everything: his illusions of exceptionalism, his lover who sacrificed herself to save him, and now even the satisfaction of preventing Sydney's plans from reaching fruition. The injustice was intolerable, and Guildenstern resolved that if he could not prevent Ashley's transformation, he would ensure the Riskbreaker's triumph was meaningless. The commander possessed knowledge from his years serving Cardinal Batistum, including rituals that the Church officially condemned, but which its agents employed when circumstances demanded. He began chanting in ancient languages, summoning powers through brute force channeling that damaged him even as it enhanced him. He was burning his life force like fuel, converting his existence into raw power without concern for sustainability, pursuing transformation through self-destruction, because he had nothing left to lose. The creature that emerged barely resembled Romeo Guildenstern anymore. It stood unnaturally tall, limbs distorted into configurations that suggested power without grace, covered in what might have been armor or might have been grotesque growths. Its face retained enough of Guildenstern's features to be recognizable, but distorted them into mask of rage and desperation. This was what happened when someone tried to force transformation their nature could not support. When ambition drove someone to claim power that fundamentally rejected them. Ashley, still adjusting to energies flooding through his restructured being, faced this transformed commander, knowing that everything had been leading to this confrontation. Guildenstern represented what Ashley might have become if rage and grief had been allowed to consume his judgment completely. A warning about refusing to accept limitations. Fighting Guildenstern was not simply eliminating threat, but confronting shadow version of himself. The battle tested Ashley's control over his new capabilities and his psychological resilience. Guildenstern fought with recklessness of someone who knew he was dying, who had already written off his own survival, who sought only to inflict maximum damage. His attacks combined physical force with channeled energies that damaged him as much as they threatened Ashley. Each strike burning through life force, each assault consuming essence that could never be recovered. Ashley fought with precision, targeting vulnerabilities that Guildenstern's desperate transformation had created, exploiting openings that appeared when the forced enhancement failed to respond as intended. Where the commander burned hot and fast, Ashley fought with controlled efficiency, not because he lacked emotion, but because his training had taught him to subordinate feeling to tactical necessity. He was better suited for the power he wielded, and these advantages meant the outcome was never really in doubt, even though Guildenstern's desperation made him dangerous. When Guildenstern finally fell, when his transformed body collapsed as the magic consuming him completed its work, Ashley felt no triumph. He saw only waste, terrible costs of ambition unmoored from realistic self-assessment, tragedy of someone who might have been genuinely excellent, but who destroyed himself pursuing exceptionalism that exceeded what his nature could support. Guildenstern's last words were curses and regrets mixed together, rage at Ashley combined with mourning for Samantha, whose sacrifice had been wasted. Then his body dissolved, consumed by the same forces he had channeled, reduced to ash that scattered across the chamber floor. In the aftermath, in silence following violent confrontation, Ashley stood among bodies and ruins, holding power he had never wanted, and understanding he could never return to what he had been. The transformation had changed him irrevocably, granting capabilities that exceeded normal human limits, while imposing burdens that would define however long his existence lasted. He could feel the power merged with his consciousness, strength that granted freedom while demanding prices that would only become clear through years of wielding it. Joshua emerged from the corner where he had hidden during the battles, somehow surviving exposure to horrors that would have broken many adults. Ashley gathered the boy, providing comfort and protection, and for a moment, amidst all the revelation and transformation and loss, he felt something genuine. Protecting this child was choice that transcended manipulation, decision that aligned with values that remained his own. If saving Joshua was the only authentic thing he accomplished in Lea Monde, it would be enough. Calo found them as the cathedral began collapsing, structural damage finally exceeding what ancient architecture could withstand. She had witnessed much of what transpired through her own strange visions, had understood that Ashley was being transformed into something beyond her ability to fully comprehend. But when Ashley spoke, when he gave orders about extracting Joshua and ensuring proper treatment of the dead, she recognized that despite all changes, some core of who he was remained intact. He was still Ashley Riot, still committed to protecting innocence, even if that commitment had become infinitely more complicated. They escaped Lea Monde as the city collapsed into the lake, ancient supports finally failing completely. The island that had been separated for 25 years surrendering to forces that time and violence had accumulated. The cursed city that had stood for 2 millennia finally fell into waters that reclaimed territory that should never have existed as separate landmass. Ashley watched from the boat, carrying them across subsiding whirlpools, witnessing the end of a place that had been simultaneously prison, temple, and testing ground. The return to Valendia proper carried its own challenges. Joshua was reunited with what remained of his family, the trauma acknowledged, but the full extent wisely left, unspoken by adults who recognized some experiences could not be processed through premature discussion. The boy would carry scars, but he would survive and grow, resilient in ways that only children can be. Calo returned to VKP headquarters to file reports that would require extensive editing. The truth about what transpired, the revelations about parliamentary programs and church violations, Ashley's transformation into vessel for powers that the modern age insisted should not exist. All of these were too complicated and too damaging to be documented without heavy sanitization. She would spend weeks crafting accounts that balanced accuracy with political necessity. The Crimson Blades who survived faced their own reckonings. Guildenstern's descent had been visible to many of them, creating situations where following orders meant contributing to actions that violated principles they had sworn to uphold. Some would confess and seek absolution. Others would leave the order entirely. Still others would rationalize and compartmentalize, placing Lea Monde into mental categories that allowed continued functioning. Cardinal Battistum would recognize that his ambitions for claiming the city's powers had died with Guildenstern and the Cursed Island. The Church's attempt to rival Parliament through acquisition of supernatural capabilities had failed catastrophically. The Cardinal would retreat from such ambitions publicly, while privately continuing to study possibilities, but with greater caution, born from witnessing consequences when ambition exceeded preparation. Parliament faced crisis as fragments of truth about VKP enhancement programs leaked despite Calo's efforts. Representatives who had known nothing demanded investigations, while those who had authorized the program scrambled to deflect blame. The revelation that parliamentary agents had been subjected to methods violating every principle about autonomy created political firestorm that would smolder for years. And Ashley, the man at the center of all these complications, found himself facing impossible choices about what came next. He could not simply return to his role as riskbreaker, could not pretend nothing fundamental had changed when he now wielded capabilities that exceeded anything his training had prepared him to deploy responsibly. The power pulsed within him, its nature merged with his consciousness, granting strength and knowledge while demanding prices that would only become clear through experience of living with them. He could feel its influence on his thoughts and perceptions, subtle reshaping that made him question whether decisions he made were truly his own. In the week following his return from Lea Monde, Ashley attempted to resume something resembling normal life, reporting to VKP headquarters and accepting assignments that theoretically fell within his previous operational parameters. But the attempt revealed how thoroughly his transformation had separated him from the world he had inhabited. His colleagues regarded him with mixture of awe and fear, recognizing that something fundamental had changed, that the operative who had left to pursue Sydney Losstarot was not the same person who had returned bearing powers that intelligence suggested should not exist. They watched him with wariness that ordinary humans displayed when confronting something that exceeded their categories, something that wore familiar face while being distinctly other beneath that superficial resemblance. The situation reached crisis when Duke Bardorba's death was officially attributed to Ashley Riot, the wristbreaker accused of murdering the parliamentary figure whose son he had rescued. The accusation was politically motivated rather than based on accurate investigation, powerful figures within Parliament recognizing that Ashley's transformation made him threat to their authority and seeking justification to eliminate him before he could use his new capabilities in ways that disrupted established hierarchies. The fact that Duke Bardorba had actually died as consequence of Sydney's death, that no murder had occurred in any meaningful sense, was irrelevant to accusers who cared more about political expedience than justice. Ashley understood immediately what the accusation represented and what it foreshadowed. Parliament would not tolerate his continued existence as independent actor capable of resisting their authority through means they could not match. The Church would view him as heretic or threat requiring elimination. Every power structure in Valendia had reason to want him neutralized, and his service record that had made him valuable now worked against him by demonstrating exactly how dangerous he could be if he chose to resist. He had become threat simply by existing, and no amount of loyalty or service could overcome that fundamental reality. So Ashley made the decision that others bearing transformative power had made before him. The choice that vessels for forces beyond normal human limits eventually discovered was their only viable option. He would leave Valendia, depart from the kingdom he had served, and the structures he had dedicated his life to protecting, disappear into the wider world, where his presence would not endanger those he cared about. It was exile, voluntary but no less absolute for being chosen rather than imposed. The price that came with transformation, whether or not that transformation had been desired. Before departing, Ashley met with Calo Merlot's one final time, the two operatives who had entered Lea Monde together, acknowledging that their paths were diverging permanently. Calo understood why he had to leave, recognized that Parliament's fear would eventually manifest as attempts at elimination that would force Ashley to either submit or fight, and fighting would create casualties among people simply following orders. She wished him well in whatever life he found beyond Valendia's borders, promised to ensure official records reflected truth when possible, accepted his request to watch over Joshua from distance and ensure the boy grew up with opportunities untainted by trauma. Their farewell was professional, two colleagues parting with mutual respect, but without emotional intimacy that would make separation more painful. Ashley had learned through experience that caring too deeply endangered those he formed connections with, that the power he now carried seemed to attract suffering to those its bearer valued. So he maintained distance even in farewell, protecting Callow through emotional unavailability, ensuring his departure cost her nothing more than loss of capable partner. Ashley Riot left Gregminster before dawn, on a morning when mist hung thick enough to obscure visibility, departing through gates that had been left conveniently unguarded by people who understood that his voluntary exile solved problems his continued presence would have created. He carried minimal supplies and wore nondescript clothing that would not attract attention, deliberately shedding every marker of identity and affiliation that had defined him during his years as riskbreaker. The man who walked through those gates was simultaneously Ashley Riot and someone else entirely, vessel for power that could reshape nations, while also being refugee fleeing from those who feared what he had become. The road ahead stretched into territories that Ashley knew only from maps and intelligence briefings, regions beyond Valendia's direct control, where different kingdoms operated according to their own customs. He would need to learn new situations where his VKP training might be irrelevant or disadvantageous, survive through capabilities and wits in environments where institutional support was not available. It was a daunting prospect, complete rupture with known life, but for Ashley it felt almost liberating. Everything about his previous existence had been orchestrated or manipulated. Now, finally, he possessed autonomy, freedom to determine his own path, even if that freedom came with burden of power he had never desired and price of exile from everything familiar. As he walked, as distance accumulated between himself and the only home he had known, Ashley reflected on everything that had transpired in Lea Monde. The revelations about manipulation and constructed identity, the discovery that his memories might be implanted rather than authentic, the understanding that his life might have served purposes determined by others, all of these should have destroyed his sense of self, and in some ways they had. The Ashley Riot, who believed himself to be grieving widower driven by loss, no longer existed in quite the same way. But paradoxically, the demolition of his assumed identity had created space for something more genuine to emerge. If everything he had believed about himself was questionable, if his memories and motivations had been shaped by others, then he was free to become whoever he chose now, to build identity through authentic choices rather than accepting programming. The uncertainty that manipulation had created could be written on with intentions that were actually his own. It was terrifying freedom, but it was freedom nonetheless, and Ashley intended to exercise it. The power within him remained constant presence, shaping his perceptions while being shaped in turn by his choices. They were becoming synthesized entity, vessel and power, merging into something that possessed qualities neither could achieve alone. This felt sometimes like corruption, worry that he was losing whatever made him human. Other times, it felt like completion, realization of potential that had always existed, but which required catalyst to manifest. Time would tell which interpretation was more accurate, or whether both contained truth that could only be reconciled through accepting that transformation was neither purely corruption nor purely fulfillment. The question of what had happened to Ashley Riot after Lea Monde would become matter of speculation and rumor in the years that followed. Some reports placed him in distant lands, a wandering figure who appeared when needed and disappeared once crisis was resolved. Others suggested he had died shortly after his exile, the transformation proving unsustainable over time. Still others claimed he had simply found quiet life somewhere remote, living under different name, trying to forget what he had been and what he had become. The truth, as with so much else in Ashley's story, remained deliberately ambiguous. The game itself provides no definitive answer about his ultimate fate, leaving players to draw their own conclusions about whether his transformation represented tragedy or transcendence, whether his exile was punishment or liberation, whether the power he gained was worth the prices it demanded. This ambiguity was not weakness in the storytelling, but rather recognition that some questions resist simple answers, that transformation carries consequences too complex to be reduced to simple judgment of success or failure. What is known with certainty is that Ashley Riot, whoever or whatever he became after leaving Valendia, paid the price that all who seek or receive power beyond normal human limits must eventually pay. The cost is measured not just in what is gained, but in what is lost. Not just in capabilities acquired, but in connections severed. Not just in strength obtained, but in humanity potentially compromised. Whether that price was worth paying, whether Ashley's transformation ultimately served purposes beyond the manipulation that created it, whether he found peace or merely survival in whatever existence followed his exile. These remain questions that each person must answer for themselves based on what they value and how they weigh competing considerations. The legacy of Vagrant Story extends beyond Ashley Riot's personal journey, rippling through understanding of what video game narratives could accomplish when they embraced complexity rather than simplifying. The game itself, released in 2000 for the original PlayStation, represented something rare in its medium: willingness to tackle difficult themes through language that elevated rather than simplified. Its story was told through Shakespearean dialogue and narrative structures that trusted players to engage with challenging material without excessive hand-holding. The game's director, Yasumi Matsuno, had already established reputation for crafting politically complex narratives through his work on earlier titles, but Vagrant Story represented perhaps the purest expression of his artistic vision. Every aspect of the game's design, from its visual aesthetic combining Gothic architecture with dark fantasy elements, to its combat system requiring understanding of enemy weaknesses and weapon customization, reinforced the central narrative about identity and transformation. The dungeon exploration through Lea Monde's ruins mirrored Ashley's psychological journey, descending through layers of constructed reality to confront uncomfortable truths deliberately buried. The critical reception was largely positive, reviewers recognizing that something unusual was being attempted, even when they struggled to articulate what made the experience distinctive. Some found the combat system too complex, requiring too much attention to details like weapon types and enemy affinities. Others felt the narrative was too opaque, demanding multiple experiences to fully comprehend. But even critics who found specific elements problematic generally acknowledged that Vagrant Story was pushing boundaries of what video game narratives could accomplish. The commercial performance was less spectacular, the game's complexity and dark themes limiting its appeal to mainstream audiences who preferred more straightforward adventures. It became cult classic rather than mass market success, beloved by those who connected with its particular approach, but never achieving sales that would justify immediate sequel. This was both artistic validation and practical tragedy, proof the game had succeeded in its ambition to create something uncompromising, while ensuring similar experiments would be viewed as risky. In years and decades following its release, Vagrant Story's reputation grew as players who had missed it initially discovered the game through word of mouth and critical retrospectives. The gaming community developed deeper appreciation for what Matsuno and his team had accomplished. recognizing that the game's willingness to embrace difficulty and ambiguity represented valuable counterpoint to industry trends. Academic analysis began examining the game's themes, drawing connections between its narrative about manipulated memory and broader questions in philosophy of mind about the nature of identity and relationship between memory and self. The visual design of Lea Monde itself deserves particular attention, as the cursed city functioned not just as setting, but as character in its own right. The Gothic aesthetic, all soaring arches and elaborate stonework decorated with religious iconography, created sense of weight and history, suggesting civilizations that had risen and fallen long before Ashley's arrival. The way light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across floors, created visual language that communicated themes about intersection of beauty and violence, faith and corruption, order and decay. Every chamber told stories through environmental details, abandoned belongings and architectural features revealing information about people who had lived and died in these spaces. The sound design complemented the visual aesthetics perfectly, using music sparingly to maximize impact when it appeared, allowing silence and ambient sounds to dominate most exploration. Footsteps echoed through empty halls with weight that emphasized Ashley's isolation. Distant sounds suggested threats lurking beyond visibility. Combat music emerged with sudden intensity matching the violence of encounters, then faded back into silence once enemies were defeated. This restraint in audio design created tension more effectively than constant musical accompaniment could have achieved, making the city feel genuinely abandoned rather than simply empty, haunted by absence rather than populated with obvious threats. The crafting and customization systems governing Ashley's equipment reflected the game's themes about identity and transformation in mechanical terms. Players were required to constantly modify and adapt weapons to face different enemy types, with no single optimal configuration that worked universally. This constant need for change mirrored Ashley's own transformation, his capabilities shifting to meet challenges rather than remaining static. The system was complex enough that mastery required significant investment, understanding not just immediate mechanics, but deeper principles about how different elements interacted. The chain system governing combat added strategic depth, allowing skilled players to string together attacks that built momentum and dealt increasing damage, but requiring precise timing and understanding of enemy patterns. Success came not from simple execution, but from observation and adaptation, learning enemy tendencies and exploiting openings that appeared briefly. This created rhythm to battles that felt almost dance-like when executed properly. The system rewarded skill while punishing carelessness, creating difficulty that felt fair even when challenging. The risk system tracking damage during battles introduced another wrinkle, with accumulated damage reducing Ashley's maximum health until he could find safe location to properly heal. This created strategic decisions about when to push forward and when to retreat, when damage could be accepted as necessary cost, and when preservation took priority. The system forced players to think about risk in ways that most games did not require, making danger feel consequential rather than simply aesthetic. But beyond mechanical systems and aesthetic choices, what makes Vagrant Story endure is the complexity of its narrative and the questions it raises about identity, power, and prices we pay for transformation. Ashley Riot's journey forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths about the constructed nature of self, the ways that memory shapes identity while being simultaneously unreliable and subject to manipulation. The revelation that is defining trauma, might be implanted fiction challenges players to consider how much of their own identities are authentic versus constructed through social conditioning and personal narrative building. Sydney Losstarot's manipulation of Ashley represents extreme version of social forces that shape all human development, exaggerated through supernatural means, but fundamentally similar to ways that families, cultures, and institutions combine to produce the people we become. None of us choose circumstances of our birth or early experiences that shape psychological foundations. We are all, to varying degrees, products of forces beyond our control. Sydney's orchestration highlights this reality, while suggesting that awareness of construction creates possibility for reconstruction, that understanding how we were made provides tools for remaking ourselves. The power Ashley gains functions as metaphor for power and its costs generally, representing capabilities that exceed normal limits while demanding prices that may exceed benefits. Ashley gains strength sufficient to resist further manipulation, but loses connection to normal human experience through transformation that separates him from mortality and everything it represents. The power is simultaneously liberation and prison, granting freedom from control while binding him to responsibilities that come with wielding capabilities others can't match. Guildenstern's tragedy illustrates dangers of defining worth through comparison and ambition, rather than accepting limitations and developing capabilities within them. The commander was genuinely talented, possibly exceptional by normal standards, but his obsessive need to be the most exceptional destroyed him when confronted with someone whose nature better matched specific requirements. His story warns about how competitive frameworks for understanding achievement can poison accomplishment and transform gifts into sources of suffering. Samantha's devotion and sacrifice raise questions about love and its relationship to clear judgment, about the point at which loyalty becomes enabling. Her absolute love for Guildenstern was genuine and admirable, representing purity of feeling that transcended self-interest, but it also enabled his worst impulses and ultimately contributed to catastrophe. The story does not provide simple answer about whether her devotion was virtue or vice, instead presenting it as complex phenomenon that was simultaneously both. The game's refusal to provide clear moral framework or simple resolution reflects sophisticated understanding of how ethical questions actually function in complex situations. Most actions contain both positive and negative elements, consequences that benefit some while harming others, outcomes that look different depending on perspective and time frame. Sydney's manipulation was cruel and violated principles about autonomy, but it also potentially prevented worse outcomes and gave Ashley capabilities that allowed him to protect people he could not have helped otherwise. Guildenstern's obsession destroyed him and Samantha, but it also prevented power from potentially falling into hands that might have used it more destructively. This moral complexity reflects reality more accurately than narratives with clear heroes and villains, acknowledging that most significant choices involve trade-offs rather than obvious right answers. The game trusts players to sit with this ambiguity rather than resolving it through authorial pronouncement, allowing different interpretations based on what individuals value and how they weigh competing considerations. This respect for player intelligence represents artistic maturity that gaming still struggles to consistently achieve. The ending, with Ashley accused of murder and choosing exile rather than facing judgment that would inevitably find him guilty regardless of actual events, provides neither victory nor defeat, but something more ambiguous and perhaps more true to how significant transformations actually feel. Ashley has gained power and lost innocence, discovered truths and lost certainty, survived catastrophe and been separated from everything familiar. The question of whether his transformation was ultimately positive or negative remains unresolved, perhaps unresolvable, dependent on factors that will only become clear through living with consequences. The vagrant of the title refers to this state of permanent wandering, existence defined by movement without settled home or stable identity, freedom that is simultaneously liberation and exile. Ashley becomes vagrant not through choice, but through necessity, his transformation making him incompatible with settled society. But there is also sense in which the vagrant state represents something valuable, perspective that comes from standing outside established structures, ability to see patterns that those embedded within systems cannot perceive. 25 years after the game's release, Vagrant Story remains relevant and powerful, its themes no less pressing in contemporary context than they were in 2000. Questions about identity and authenticity have perhaps grown more urgent in age of social media and curated personal brands, where construction of self for public consumption has become expected rather than exceptional. The game's exploration of memory manipulation gains new resonance in an era where misinformation creates uncertainty about basic facts. Ashley's struggle to determine who he is beneath constructed identity mirrors broader cultural anxieties about authenticity and reliability of our perceptions. The game's treatment of power and its costs speaks to contemporary concerns about capabilities outpacing wisdom to wield them responsibly, about achieving abilities to reshape fundamental aspects of experience before developing ethical frameworks adequate to guide their application. The question of whether power justifies its costs, whether transformation represents progress or merely change, whether capabilities should be pursued simply because they become available, these remain as urgent now as they were in fantasy context of Lea Monde's Cursed Ruins. Vagrant Story stands as testament to what video games can accomplish when they embrace complexity rather than simplifying, when they trust players to engage with difficult questions rather than providing easy answers, when they prioritize artistic vision over commercial calculation. It is not perfect, its mechanics sometimes frustrating in their complexity, its narrative occasionally too opaque, but its ambitions and willingness to tackle themes that most games avoid make it significant beyond its mechanical qualities, important not just as entertainment, but as art that engages seriously with questions about human nature and prices we pay for power and transformation. The story of Ashley Riot, of Sydney Losstarot and Romeo Guildenstern and Samantha, of Lea Monde, and the dark powers and costs of wielding capabilities beyond normal human limits, deserves to be remembered and revisited. It is a story about losing yourself and finding something else in the space where certainty used to live, about the constructed nature of identity and possibility of authentic choice, even within constraints of manipulation, about exile and wandering and what it means to exist outside structures that most people never question or escape. Perhaps, in the end, that is the most important legacy of Vagrant Story, the reminder that some of the most profound stories resist simple summarization or comfortable resolution. That art which respects its audience enough to present complexity rather than reducing it serves function that cannot be replaced by more accessible alternatives. That difficulty and ambiguity are not flaws to be eliminated, but essential components of experiences that matter beyond immediate entertainment value. Ashley Riot's journey through Lea Monde and beyond is not easy story to tell or hear, not comfortable narrative that provides reassurance or escapist relief, but it is true story in ways that transcend factual accuracy, capturing something essential about transformation and identity and power that simpler narratives cannot reach. if you found something meaningful in this journey. If the tale of Lea Monde and the questions it raises about who we are beneath the identities we've been given resonated with your own experiences, consider sharing those thoughts in the comments below. These stories from gaming's past offer more than nostalgia. They provide frameworks for understanding questions that remain relevant regardless of when they were first asked. Until the next forgotten corner of gaming history calls us to explore its depths, remember that every story we tell ourselves about who we are carries elements of both truth and construction. And sometimes the most profound transformations come not from gaining power, but from losing certainty about who we thought we were.